everyone, it's Hannah Catherine with Eaddy's Craft Room here to talk about 5 mistakes I made as a beginner quilter in my first year of quilting, so that hopefully if you are a new quilter, you can learn from them and be much further in your quilting journey earlier on than I was. Just a disclaimer here because it's the internet and I feel the need to say so. All of these are more traditional mistakes made in quilting, but as with art, it's subjective and ultimately it should be about what makes you happy and what makes you enjoy your process and produce the best result possible. So these are the things that I have changed to allow me to achieve that, but maybe you might do so differently, and that's okay. So let's go ahead and dive in. Number 1 is not saving scraps. I know, shocking. I'm someone who hates clutter and I live in the city, I live in an apartment, and so I don't have a ton of room for storage. So when I first started quilting, I didn't realize the value that scraps had, and so I just threw them out. I just figured I was done with that fabric line, I was done with that quilt, I probably wouldn't use them again, and I couldn't imagine buying like the same fabric again to make the same quilt. It just didn't compute the possibilities that I could achieve if I just saved them and over time accumulated more and more. Plus, fabric is so expensive, especially if you're like me and decide to just go full force into a new hobby and you want the best of the best. That's how I did it. Yeah, I mean, when you're looking at $11, $12, $13 a yard for fabric, those scraps truly are precious. So I would encourage you to save your scraps. Maybe you're not saving all of them, but saving the ones at the very least that you like and saving that precious background fabric, because I promise you there are possibilities out there of future projects down the line. So I would encourage you to save those. Don't throw them away, even if you're like me and you hate clutter and you hate things that are quote unquote meaningless for the moment. I promise you, later down the line, they will have some meaning and you'll be able to use fabric again that hopefully you loved because you already bought it and make something beautiful. Number 2 is starching pre-cuts or quilt kits that I did not have measurements for. So let me tell you what I mean by this. If you are not aware, when you starch fabric, it does shrink. And so the first quilt I ever made was what we call a shortcut quilt. And so I used a pre-cut jelly roll and decided to starch all of my fabric, including the jelly roll, and could not figure out for the life of me why my measurements were so off. And the reality is that when you starch, you do lose a little bit of your overall area of the fabric. And as you know, a 1/4 inch seam is everything in quilting, and when you just get a little bit off on that 1/4 inch, it can throw off the whole thing or your points don't match up. And so the same thing goes for losing, even if it's just 1/8 of an inch or 1/16 of an inch from that shrinkage of the fabric. It will make a difference. So to be honest, you can go ahead and starch yardage if you like the feel of it, but I got to a point and place where I just decided I didn't need it anymore and just a good iron would do it for me. And that's how I've gotten to doing my quilts now. And so I just don't even worry about it, you know? Starching also just is an extra step. And generally when I get my fabrics for my projects, I'm so excited to start them. I don't want to have to like sit there and starch all of them and let them dry overnight. I just want to jump into the project. So that is how I have changed, but knowing this tip would have saved me a little bit of a headache instead of trying to figure out why things weren't working out. Just back to that original quilt, what I ended up doing was just cutting down the blocks like 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 of an inch and making the quilt that way. Thankfully, the pattern did allow for that. It definitely looked a little funky, but you know what? It was my first quilt. I was so proud of it and I'm so glad I learned from it. And hopefully you can learn from my mistakes too. Speaking of fabric prep and giving your fabric a good iron, the next mistake that I made was not ironing my fabric before I cut. I don't know if some of you out there are just like grabbing your hair and screaming. To me, it was just something I just didn't think was necessary. I can't believe that now, but again, I think it goes back to that excitement of just wanting to get into the project and start seeing results. And to be honest, those results are going to be subpar to the results that you would get if you just took the time in the front end to iron everything out and make sure your cuts are super accurate. When you are not ironing before cutting, you can get elbows in your fabric. You are going to have to just make fresh cuts more often, and you're going to be more wasteful of your fabric. And overall, precision is so important in quilting specifically, but in other mediums as well. And so it is so important to set yourself up for success so that all of the time and money and effort and energy that you put into creating something is worthwhile at the end. And ironing is just part of that process and something that I really regret not taking my time on previously. Now, let me tell you, part of the reason why I did not want to start ironing was because I was ironing with like my roommate's travel iron on a travel ironing board on my bed in my bedroom in my apartment when I first got started, my old apartment, which was much smaller and darker than this one. So things have changed a little bit more. For Christmas last year, I actually, and it's on right now, so it's gonna make a noise, but I got the Aliso iron and I absolutely love it. I'm still using a travel size ironing board, but it works well in my space currently now that I have a special room to create, and I'm really thankful for that. But even then, no excuses. I should have ironed, especially easier things to iron like jelly rolls, or even sometimes a layer cake or a charm pack might need a good press. So encourage you to do that so that your results are as good as they can be. Next up, a mistake I made was not getting a true 1/4 inch seam, not measuring and kind of just guessing. I don't know if this is the creative part of my brain, but it's just something that I didn't realize was so important when I started. I actually just used a foot that had a mark on it that came with my machine that I just assumed was like a 1/4 inch seam. It was not. And I've actually heard that a lot of feet on machines have a 1/2 inch, I believe, foot, which is traditional for garment sewing, not necessarily for quilting. So I would encourage you to measure your feet if you haven't already, if you're just doing like what I've done in the past and just assuming. That would be a good thing to do. I also went ahead and just bought some marking tape that I have put on my machine. This really helps me when I'm sewing like 1/2 square triangles, or just adding an extra layer of checks and balances for me to make sure I'm getting that 1/4 inch seam and not being afraid to just go ahead and rip something up when it's really off. I finally came to the realization that I was spending so much money and so much time on my materials and putting my quilt together that it was worth it to spend an extra 5 or maybe even 10 minutes to go ahead and really check things out. Now, I am a firm believer in not letting perfect be the enemy of the good, especially when it comes to my hobbies and my free time. Work is a little bit different, but for my hobbies and my free time, I don't want to be neurotic about something, so you will certainly see some points off in some of my quilts, but overall, I do try and make sure that things are lined up nicely because it's worth it, and I owe it to myself to do them well and right the first time. So measure out that 1/4 inch seam. Don't be afraid to check it, and don't be afraid to try it again if it's not right the first time. One more note on precision, and my 5th and probably not final mistake that I made in my first year of quilting is not squaring up my blocks. So for those of you who are new, squaring up your blocks basically means that you take the block, the quilt block that you have made, set it on your cutting table and measure it so that it matches up with the anticipated block size in your pattern. And you might be a little bit over, you might be a little bit under. Ideally, if you have been very precise with everything along the way, everything from your 1/4 inch seam to your cutting to making sure things are ironed and straight, you'll be right on the money. But if you're like me and imperfect and still learning, you might be a little bit over or under. And so squaring up that block allows you to cut off any excess and also trim a couple of threads, which makes it a much cleaner experience sewing instead of just threads everywhere. And so I would encourage you to do that if you haven't already. And having a squared up block and a series of squared up blocks allow you to have more accurate rows and then more accurate piecing overall. Now, on that note for squaring up, I would also encourage you to do that with pre-cuts. This is a huge part of this mistake because I love sewing with pre-cuts. I don't love cutting yardage. So the quilts that I make are mostly pre-cut based quilts. And I just assumed that, oh, it says 2.5 inch strips, they're 2.5 inch, or they're 5 inch or 10 inch or whatever the, the dimensions are. And that is not always the case. Don't just trust what it says on the packaging because of the way fabric is constructed and the bias and just general human error or even machine error in cutting. They're not always 100% accurate. So don't be afraid to get those pieces of fabric onto your cutting mat and make any adjustments you need before you start sewing instead of just trusting the process, which is sometimes what I like to do. It's always worth another look at them. Just because they're labeled that way doesn't always mean that each one is 100% perfect. So take that responsibility onto yourself and give it a shot and see, are your pre-cut pieces of fabric actually what they say they are? As I said earlier, that list is certainly not exhaustive. I made plenty other mistakes along the way, but those were the 5 that I felt were the most important, and I've had the most radical change over my last year of quilting. It's so exciting being able to look back on a year of quilts and think through all of what I've learned and all of the fun and enjoyment I've had, as well as the gifts that I've been able to give to those most special in my life because of this hobby. So I hope you are finding the same exact experience, whether you have been quilting for a week or 40 or 50 years. Thank you so much for watching again, and let me know, what have you been learning from your quilting experience down below in the comments. I would love to hear from you and learn from you in this community. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.